So, I didn't really know anything at all about All Saints Day until seminary. For the most part, we don't really do saints down south. And although the United Methodist Church does technically observe All Saints, I think you'll find that many Methodists really have no idea what Methodists believe. So until my first year in Boston, all I really remembered of anything about saints was that I saw a news report on 2020 in third grade about how Catholics worship statues as God, and that's idolatry. That's all I got. And though my seminary community introduced me to the rituals, the lighting of candles, I didn't really connect with the idea of keeping any saints until my friend Carrie David in Philly spoke to me about Our List of Saints. He had a very long list. Few of them canonized Catholic saints. I forget most of the names, but I know that Jimi Hendrix, George Harrison, and John Lennon were all there, and they were very far from the only pop stars, if that gives you an idea of what we were working with. And that's actually what really made the entire concept of having saints speak to me in the first place. What I had heard of was that you read through a textbook of mostly very old figures to learn about their lives, but I got used to this idea that saints really could be anyone who are no longer with us, whose guidance we seek and whose example we wish to follow. So at that point, I began to keep my own saints. It was and is a much smaller list. Carrie David had dozens of them. I have currently 7. I'm really particular about that. I don't really canonize anyone if I don't feel a profound sense of kinship. So there are many people that I admire and look up to, Harvey Milk, Martin Luther King, but I don't sense it in the same way. They don't make the list. I can tell you, though, that keeping this, what is to me kind of an exotic form of spiritual practice, it has become, in a queer, non-traditional way, a very powerful and tangible and deep practice to me. To keep saints is to ground oneself in spiritual forefathers or foremothers or foreparents as a way of weathering the storm. It's more than remembering history or keeping tradition. It's much more than appealing to St. Anthony because you can't find your glasses. It's recognizing that others have walked the same path that we're on now, that the trail is softer for their footsteps, and that we can be heartened to know that it can be walked because it has been walked. For queer people, like most, if not all of us in the room tonight, I dare say it is even more important because we have had harder trails to blaze, steeper hills to climb, and thornier trails to travel down. So it's that much more crucial with that understanding to honor our history and take heart to those who have endured this before us. I get ahead. I'm not going to forgive myself if I speak any further in this sermon without getting to the text. So this particular passage in Hebrews is one of many racing metaphors we see for faith and encouragement. There's several of these. It's one that I particularly enjoy the more I think about it, specifically because of this idea of perseverance or endurance. It depends on your translation. It has this idea of this cloud of witnesses watching us and encouraging us, but moreover, it's watching us and encouraging perseverance, not speed in the race, so to speak. And races aren't primarily about perseverance. Perseverance is necessary to win the race, of course, but all of the perseverance in the world won't make up for speed if you're trying for first place. Which tells me that more than anything, what we're not looking for is to zip through and finish first. We're just looking to finish. We know the trials, the heat, the steep hills, the short breath, the muscle aches, and we're all looking to finish strong and to hold tight even though many days it feels difficult. What makes it all the more crucial to have those we revere watching and encouraging us. Encouragement is helpful for speed, but it is necessary for perseverance. There is and will come in any race or any trial a time when the road feels rough and it's easier to just give up. But I also believe that we all know firsthand how much easier it is to press on with just a little voice telling us that you can. More importantly, however, I think the context of this letter is really central to why I think it's important to discussing saints, especially among the queer community. Hebrews in general is a letter about staying strong and not giving up to a community that faced a fair share of persecution. These audience, these were a people living in the context of a Jewish society attempting to embrace a wholly new and different faith. As you may have guessed, this didn't go over well with the rest of the Jewish community. So at the time of writing, it was tempting to turn back for those in the community. It was tempting for them to forget this new faith they had founded and just embrace the socially condoned religion of the surrounding community. Many had already done so by the writing of this letter. The primary goal of this letter is to tell a suffering, persecuted minority to hold firm to what they believe in the face of oppression. And in this writing, there's a clear exhortation to remember your community, your saints, your witnesses to the struggle, not only those who surround you now, but those who did face this same struggle before you and know it well. Particularly, I think this text is even more resonant to the queer community because of the central conflict. You see, at this time, in the community, there were two large groups. There were Judaizers, Christians who came from Jewish communities and who believed that anyone not born Jewish must convert and begin to keep Jewish laws in order to consider themselves Christians. And on the other side, antinomians, who were Christians who believed that Judaism and Christianity were mutually exclusive, and that any who wished to follow Jesus must forsake Jewish laws. Now, the writer of this letter, who's probably not Paul, but the writer of this letter kind of comes down in the middle and says, no, everyone can come as they are. You don't have to convert to or from Judaism. But if we think of it in this context, can you really imagine what it is like to have someone tell you that in order to practice your faith, you have to change a crucial facet of your being and deny a central part of yourself? I mean, that must be really hard, guys. This community had it rough. Now, if we move on also to this text from Habakkuk, read this evening, I picked this one essentially for two reasons. The first is just I was in a really bad mood when I started exegeting this sermon, and it kind of worked. But beyond that, I wanted us to have a sense of this visceral apocalypticism, what it feels like to live in a world with this injustice and suffering that we live in, the prophets lived in, and the community of the Hebrews lived in. I know you know it well because I know we all know it, and the older I get, the more apocalyptic the world feels in general, and honestly, the more it feels like it's always been apocalyptic. It's a small wonder that the end of the world is predicted every 5 years or so, and really has been since years before Jesus was born, because it just feels like that a lot of the time. I know that we've all felt that, the idea of being bogged down, struggling to see light through the gray, wondering where justice, where healing, where rightness is. So when I read this passage and other texts from the Hebrew prophets, I feel that same kinship as with the saints, that they've suffered through difficult times, and now they're writing about how they managed, what they faced, what they found they could do to get by. Not to triumph, not to win first place. You don't really see a lot of triumph with the Hebrew prophets. It's not really their bag. But getting by through any manner of evil times, I believe we can understand that. I believe that in our time, and for the audience of Hebrews in their time, and for the prophets in their time, we're all dealing with different flavors of the exact same problems. But at the end of the day, they made it through. They muddled and felt pain, and it probably didn't feel like it was worth it a lot of the time, but they persevered. And we are called to persevere too, even in dark times such as these. So with the advantage of borrowing strength from the ancestors we know have faced times like this already. This is why we have saints. And not only do I feel that we as queer people understand that context better, but by virtue of the community we formed, we also need so much more to keep our historical figures in our memories and in our hearts. For one thing, we don't necessarily have literal ancestors to turn to, it makes us distinct in terms of marginalized groups. For those who face sexism or racism or classism, for the most part, they're inheriting a legacy. They're born into a community or into a group of people, and they learn from that community what it's like to live in the world. If you live in this world as a woman, there are other women to tell you that. If you live in this world as a black person, you probably grew up around a lot of other black people. I can tell you, if you grew up poor, you were surrounded by many other poor folks. When we enter the queer community property, they don't assign us a mentor. We don't really have parents or neighbors to point us the way, so every single one of us has to find people who can teach us to live as we are. It's an awkward experience that I know you all lived through, and you know this. In addition, in our specific age of queerdom, we need to remember our history because we are still suffering a missing generation and still coping with the aftermath of an epidemic. There are still many of us who are not here who would have been otherwise. The boldest, most outspoken, most risk-taking of us are no longer here. So then how much more do we need the wisdom and strength and perseverance of them and others who have gone before us and fought for this? How much more do we have to learn from the past when we have been strangers left to grope in the dark until we find the spark of community of those who understand? How much more when so many of those who would be here to offer guidance have been sacrificed to bigotry, inaction, and plague? So since I've been talking about this importance of remembering our queer saints this entire time, I'm going to take a minute to indulge and introduce mine. To begin with, Emma Goldman was a radical anarchist journalist and activist in the late 19th and early 20th century. She spoke out in favor of the rights of the working class and of women and against the cruelties of capitalism. And she was also an early advocate for non-monogamy at the turn of the 20th century. She reminds me to be bold and outspoken. Virgilio Piñera was an absurdist Cuban fiction writer. He spoke out against the wealthy elites who kept their fellow countrymen in bondage, and then, after the Communist Revolution, also spoke out against the regime that cast out those who were different. He eventually faced house arrest for being an avant-garde homosexual who refused to keep his mouth shut, and died in solitude. And he reminds me to criticize injustice in any forms and to keep being weird. Sylvia Rivera was a trans sex worker present at the Stonewall riots. She became well known for organizing the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries with Marsha P. Johnson. They were a group of sex workers who banded together to take care of each other and fight for queer and trans justice. Moreover, she spoke out against the wider queer community for ignoring the trans population that was on the front lines of violence. She reminds me to be fierce when protecting those in danger. Vito Russo was an activist and author of the foundational text, The Celluloid Closet. He organized, presented debates on queer issues of the day, and was known to compulsively study decades and decades of film in regards to queerness in order to present lectures on them. He reminds me that obsession can be healthy. David Wojnarowicz was an abstract writer, photographer, and filmmaker in the downtown New York scene in the late 80s and early 90s. He was a strident voice in the fight against AIDS. I misunderstood him for a long time. He seemed like a very one-dimensional, angry figure. Last year I had the benefit of viewing an exhibit of his at the Whitney, and I came to understand more that he was really in constant awe of the world. The only reason he was so angry was because our society does so much to ruin that abundant life and to kill those who appreciate it. So he reminds me to be righteously angry in defense of love and beauty. Walter Trochez was a gay rights activist in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, who was murdered in broad daylight in December 2013. I was living a 40-minute drive away at the time and was struck to the bone to hear of his assassination. In many ways, this was when I began to embrace my own gay identity and to resist those who reject it. He reminds me not to compromise myself for those whose acceptance is fickle and conditional. Now, it's not necessarily intentional that these people are almost all queer. That's just how it's kind of worked out so far. None of them were ever canonized, probably not Catholic, and pretty much all of them would be very shocked to learn that I'm talking of them from a pulpit right now. But they give me strength in difficult times, and moreover, they give me something to grow into. They are emblems of the person I want to be, not only memories of the past, but dreams for the future, for the uncertain times I live in, from the uncertain times they lived in. So I do that with a mind of inviting you now to consider the saints in your own life, the people who have gone on, who give you strength, who make you feel like you can pull through when things are hard, and who give you something to believe in. I didn't bring candles tonight, but I invite you all the same to remember them and take strength from that remembrance.
There's candles over there.
Oh, okay, there's candles over there if you like, actually. There you are. I invite you to take strength from that remembrance so that you can run the race with perseverance in any manner of uncertain times. Thank you.